Next on Currents News, Jeff Sessions is out. The Attorney General making the announcement after President Trump asked for his resignation. The results are in. A list of high-profile local, state, and national elections have been decided tonight. What's next? Plus, the president is weighing in. On the topic of abortion, 2 states voted to amend their constitutions last night. Plus, funeral directors in New York are saying their businesses are being killed by greedy developers. It's a Currents News special report. All that and more right now. Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Faublas. We begin with breaking news tonight. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has resigned. President Trump asked Sessions to step down. His resignation letter was delivered to White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. Sessions wrote, quote, "Dear Mr. President, at your request, I am submitting my resignation. Since the day I was honored to be sworn in as Attorney General of the United States, I came to work at the Department of Justice every day, determined to do my duty and serve my country. I have done so to the best of my ability, working to support the fundamental legal processes that are the foundation of justice." President Trump tweeted, "Matthew G. Whitaker, Chief of Staff to Attorney General Jeff Sessions at the Department of Justice, will become our new acting Attorney General of the U.S. He will serve our country well." Now that the dust has settled from the midterm elections, President Trump is speaking out and taking aim at those who opposed his campaign message. Karen Kafa is in Washington with more.
After the most expensive and one of the most contentious midterm campaigns in U.S. history, both parties walking away with something to talk up.
This election marks the largest Senate gains for a president's party in a first midterm election since at least President Kennedy's in 1962.
In an often combative press conference on Wednesday, President Trump took credit for wins in tight Senate races.
I think people like me. I think people like the job I'm doing, frankly.
Democrats taking control of the House for the first time in 8 years and pledging to keep the president and Republicans in check.
American people want to put an end to unchecked GOP control of Washington, restoring again the checks and balances envisioned by our founders.
The Democratic victory in the House seen as a voter rebuke of the president, his policies, and his rhetoric. But Republicans holding on to the Senate and ousting at least 3 Democrats in red states in the process. A divided Congress will now require a more bipartisan approach to legislating in order to avoid gridlock in Washington.
Hopefully we can all work together next year to continue delivering for the American people.
We will strive for bipartisanship. We believe that we have a responsibility to seek common ground.
The new dynamic between the 2 parties on the Hill and the White House will now set the tone for the 2020 presidential race. In Washington, Karen Kafa, Currents News.
A polarized political climate drew record-breaking early voting and a heavy Election Day turnout for the 2018 midterms. It was an election of firsts. The midterms saw an unprecedented number of female, LGBT, and first-time candidates. The winners of the night, the most women ever elected to the House. Some 234 women won the House and Senate primaries this year. Women have never held more than 20% of congressional seats. There were also groundbreaking victories for minorities. Native Americans, Muslims, Black, and gay candidates all took home wins. That includes the youngest Congresswoman ever elected at just 29 years old, the first Native American and Muslim Congresswoman, and the first openly gay governor. Both sides are claiming the results as a victory, but as we said, for many it was a personal feat. Currents News' Michelle Powers reports on some of the winners that made history.
While President Trump is declaring victory, the reality of last night's election is a bit more complicated. His party managed to pick up seats in the Senate, but the Democrats took control of the House.
Today is more than about Democrats and Republicans. It's about restoring the Constitution's checks and balances to the Trump administration.
2018 was also a year of historic firsts. Congress will have the first 2 female Muslim members after victories in Minnesota and Michigan. And Colorado has elected the country's first openly gay man as governor. Voters in Kansas and New Mexico are sending the first Native American women to Congress.
I never imagined a world where I would be represented by someone who looks like me.
Joining them will be the first female senator representing Tennessee and the first female governor of South Dakota. But for one first, the future is still uncertain. As votes continue to be collected and counted, the race for governor in Georgia is extremely close. Democrat Stacey Abrams, who could be the nation's first black female governor, is trailing Republican Brian Kemp. It's a battle that has been rife with controversy, as well as high-profile support from presidents and celebrities.
Across our state, folks are opening up the dreams of voters in absentee ballots, and we believe our chance for a stronger Georgia is just within reach.
Michelle Powers, Current News.
Governor Andrew Cuomo was reelected for a third term as governor last night, taking 56% of the votes against Mark Molinaro, who had 39%. And Letitia James was overwhelmingly elected as New York Attorney General. Her victory against Republican nominee Keith Wofford makes her the first woman AG in New York's history. Combined with Governor Cuomo's reelection and an overwhelming majority in the state assembly, the Democrats now control all levels of New York's state government. The Dems took control of the New York State Senate for the first time in a decade. The Democratic ranks rose from 31 to at least 37, giving them the largest majority held in modern history of the 63-seat chamber. Among those looking at the impact of this midterm election are church leaders. Dennis Paus is the director of communications for the New York State Catholic Conference. They represent the bishops of the Empire State in working with government to shape laws and to shape policies. Mr. Paus joins us now to talk the bigger picture. Dennis, thank you so much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure, Liz.
Dennis, we've discussed the outcome of last night's elections throughout our program tonight at length. One very important question for you, though, put it into context for us. How does the outcome of these historic elections ultimately affect Catholics at large?
Well, Catholics are part of the greater country, but let's try and narrow down to some of the things that Catholics are interested in. And first and foremost, our bishops always tell us the right to life and from conception to natural death is always a critical issue. In New York, the news is bad in that regard, in that with the Democratic takeover of the state Senate to give the Democratic Party a complete control in Albany, that means that the Reproductive Health Act, which is an abortion expansion proposal, will no doubt pass very early in 2019. That's bad news for Catholics. On the positive side of the Democrats controlling the Senate, we'll see more things that may be favorable toward immigrants, like the New York State DREAM Act, or one bill we've been fighting for decades, the Farm Workers Fair Labor Protection Act, which is for migrant farm workers to give them the justice that they deserve and just fair treatment that they're exempt from under the labor law. So it's a mixed bag. It always is.
Dennis, I want to get to an issue that has been the topic of much debate. You have said that the New York State Catholic Conference welcomes discussions about some type of provision that would allow child sex abuse victims who under current state law cannot seek justice to be able to do so. So with the congressional shift in the balance of power, what would that conversation now sound like?
Well, with the shift in Albany, with the Democrats controlling the Senate, that makes the likely passage of the Child Victims Act much more of a reality. The Child Victims Act would create a window where people who were abused decades ago, even the 40s or 50s, could bring new lawsuits. The good news is our bishops have taken an initiative, including in Brooklyn, but in every state, in every diocese in the state, they've already begun to do that themselves, right? With the Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Program that I know you've reported on, where victims who are time barred can come in and they are getting compensation, and it's real dollars that they're getting, and they've been very happy with that program. So we'll see if that passes, what the result will be for the church, but we are urging all legislators to make sure it applies to all survivors. Right now, the bill that's being sponsored by Democrats cuts out public schools. Public school victims would not be treated the same way. They wouldn't have the same access to the courts. We can't support something that would treat victims differently, survivors differently. So we say, if they do a bill, we want it to include public institutions as well.
And how will our new Attorney General, Letitia James, help in this respect?
Well, as you know, the current outgoing Attorney General, Barbara Underwood, has initiated an investigation civil investigation of the 8 dioceses of New York State with regard to child sex abuse, has subpoenaed records regarding dealing with sex abuse, that the dioceses now are hard at work cooperating with that investigation. I believe that Tish James will continue that investigation. I have no reason to believe otherwise. We know that there's bad stuff in the past, decades in the past. We know that things weren't always done right. In fact, many times they were done horribly wrong. And there is a reckoning coming and an accounting for that. And I think the bishops are prepared for that, because only with that transparency can we move forward as a church.
Dennis Paus, thank you so much for that information. Very useful and very insightful. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Liz.
2 U.S. states have voted to amend their constitutions to reject the public funding of abortion. West Virginia and Alabama approved pro-life amendments declaring that it is the public policy of those states to recognize and support the sanctity and rights of unborn life. In West Virginia, the measure passed by 52%, while in Alabama it passed by 59%. Another issue on the ballot last night was the legalization of marijuana. Several states were added to the growing list of legal places to smoke cannabis. Now in Michigan, people 21 and over can smoke pot. The measure also changes current related violations from crimes to civil infractions. In Missouri and Utah, doctors can now prescribe marijuana for medicinal purposes. In one of the biggest Democratic victories of last night's midterm elections, Florida voters decided to restore the voting rights to over 1 million convicted felons who complete their sentences. The referendum does not apply to anyone convicted of murder or any sex offenses. The change is expected to affect future election results in Florida. There's a lot more news headed your way. The business some thought could never die. Funeral homes are in decline across Brooklyn and Queens. Find out why in a Currents News special report next. The Bishop of Brooklyn is warning that the United States can become a fortress that will admit no one in need of help under any circumstances. It's in this week's tablet, and Editor-in-Chief Jorge Dominguez is here with a preview. And can anything stop a plane already going down from crashing? The Federal Aviation Administration does have a plan. And an important programming note to share with you, Currents News will be moving to new time slots. Starting Monday, December 3rd, the news will air a half hour earlier at 7 p.m. right here on NET. Reruns will air at 10 p.m. and then the next morning again at 7:30 a.m. So mark your calendars. We'll be right back. There's a troubling trend when it comes to funeral homes in New York City. Many owners are complaining, saying that they're being pushed out of the communities that they serve. Currents News' Tim Harfman is here with those details. Tim.
Liz, family-owned and operated funeral homes are struggling to stay open. Funeral directors say their landlords are seeing green, selling off their properties to developers, and finding a new location to operate is nearly impossible.
3 weeks.
John Heyer owns Heyer and Scotto Funeral Home, but his business doesn't have a home. Heyer is forced to rent space and operate out of other funeral homes in New York.
When our lease was up, it was not renewed because they decided to do something different with the property. That has now forced me to be a homeless funeral home.
Family-owned and operated funeral homes are becoming more scarce in the city. There are several reasons why. One of them is rising real estate values. Landlords are selling their properties to developers for big bucks and pushing these businesses out. Many funeral homes aren't left with many options but to rent space from funeral homes that are still operating. In Brooklyn and Queens, there are now nearly 300 funeral home businesses. That's 100 less than were operating 10 years ago. Being pushed out of the buildings is not the only factor driving funeral homes out of business.
Hello, D'Arienzo.
John D'Arienzo is a fourth-generation funeral director. He's also the vice president of the New York Metropolitan Funeral Directors Association. John says Catholics are choosing cheaper funeral options, and that means less income.
They don't see the value in the traditional two-day wake, the mass, the cemetery. Just a simple cremation and a memorial service accomplishes the same goal.
In 1970, just 5% of people chose cremation. Last year, about 55% decided to be cremated. By 2030, that number is predicted to rise to 71%, according to the Cremation Association of North America.
My grandfather would do a cremation once every 3 years. My dad would do one cremation a year. I'm over 50% cremation.
What this is doing is it's really cutting out much of the service that we used to provide, as well as the merchandise and the things that were necessary for the wake and for burial.
Several trends that are now leaving doubts about the future of what used to be considered a lucrative business. Funeral directors say choosing cremation may save money now, but they also remind their clients that finding future generations to care for the ashes may be very difficult.
Oh, Tim, so many changes. Tell me, what's behind this motive, behind families choosing these cheaper funeral options than the traditional services that we all know about?
Well, John Heyer believes it's a change in ideology. He says past generations used their relatives' money to give them the best funeral possible. But in today's generation, they prefer to keep the inheritance for themselves. So basically, Liz, it comes down to greed.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much for that report, Tim. A diocese in Iowa is apologizing for covering up a priest's sexual abuse. The Diocese of Sioux City issued the response after an investigation by the Associated Press. Father Jerome Coyle once admitted to his then bishop of abusing 50 boys over a 20-year period decades ago. He was removed from ministry in 1986. The diocese apologized for failing to notify parishes and also asking victims to come forward when Father Coyle confessed. Meanwhile, Guam's Catholic Church is filing for bankruptcy. The move allows the Archdiocese to avoid $115 million in lawsuits alleging child sexual abuse by priests and move towards settlements. Now, according to Archbishop Michael Burns, the bankruptcy will, quote, bring the greatest measure of justice to the greatest number of victims. Keeping up with the latest in news Catholics should know about is the Diocese of Brooklyn's tablet newspaper. Jorge Dominguez is the paper's editor-in-chief. He's here once again to talk to us about this week's paper. Jorge, thank you. Always great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Liz.
I want to talk about Bishop DiMarzio's column, Put Out into the Deep. Bishop DiMarzio takes a very hard stance on immigration. Tell us about that.
Well, I think one of these main themes is immigration, and this is one of the best columns I ever read by him. I mean, it's a very serious, deep analysis of the immigration issue in the context of, today's politics.
And he's a noted expert in immigration, so it stands to reason that he would speak about that.
His whole life of a priest and a bishop, he has been dedicated to the immigration issue, so he knows the issue very well, and he has very clear ideas about it.
And we do know that immigration is a hot button issue with regard to politics. So I want to clarify, as you're here with me today, that Bishop's article is not a political statement.
That could be a reductionist vision of the article. It is not about politics. It's about the Christian doctrine and the Christian moral about the issue of immigration. Basically, what he is saying is that when we analyze all the situation that we confront today with a caravan in Mexico, with the illegal immigrants, with all the policies that the administration is proposing today, we have to base our positions in the Christian doctrine, about immigrants and about poor people.
As always, thank you so much, Jorge. Supporting the tablet ensures that Catholic journalism will thrive well into the future. These are stories that oftentimes can't be found anywhere else. Subscribe to the tablet right now. You save up to 55%. Go to the website, thetablet.org/55, or you can call 1-877-883-8356. Also in the news, the FAA has issued a new directive tonight detailing the steps each crew member should take if they encounter a problem in the air similar to the one that caused Lion Air Flight 610 to crash in Indonesia last month. Omar Jimenez reports.
New guidance coming from Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration as overseas, investigators continue to dive for answers into what exactly happened to Lion Air Flight 610 when it crashed into the Java Sea last week. All 189 passengers and crew on board were killed. The head of Indonesia's search and rescue agency says his team is still working to locate the cockpit voice recorder, which he believes is buried under the mud. But the other black box showing the actual flight data was found last week, indicating the plane had only conducted 19 flights, including its last one. But it's really the last 4 that investigators are keying in on. That's because for all of those 4, the plane had a malfunctioning indicator, including at the time of the crash. Indonesian investigators further say Flight 610 had issues in its angle of attack, or AOA sensors, an automated system which helps the pilot obtain proper airspeed for optimal lift. It's part of Boeing's statement, advising pilots about how to handle circumstances where there is erroneous input from an AOA sensor. The FAA also alerting the issue, specifically for the 737 MAX 8. Meanwhile, families of some of the victims were taken by boat to the crash site location to pray and see the recovery process in person. The focus of continuing efforts will be recovering additional victim remains and trying to locate the cockpit voice recorder. The last ping was heard on Saturday. Omar Jimenez, Currents News.
And still to come on Currents News, for years, the faithful have been fascinated by Pope Francis's devotion to the Blessed Mother. But what exactly is behind the Holy Father's deep reverence? We have that answer next. Many Catholics have particular devotions to religious figures, including Pope Francis. There's a brand new book out about the Holy Father's undying devotion to the Blessed Mother. Melissa Butts has more.
Pope Francis's devotion to the Blessed Mother has a very particular explanation, one that Father Alexander reveals in his book, She is My Mother. Since May 31st, 2017, Father Alexander has been the Secretary of the Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life, but he's known the Pope for years. Through his book, he tries to delve into a deep and personal aspect of Pope Francis's life that has often gone unnoticed. In it, he expressed his conversation with the Pope. Pope Francis told him that one of the fundamental factors that led him to love the Mother of God was the devotion of the people.
I believe the people also taught him to love our mother. When he made the pilgrimages as a pastor, he participated with young people and discovered that the more we love people, the more we love the way people pray.
Another place where devotion for the Blessed Mother was deeply instilled was in his own family, thanks to his grandmother and priest Enrique Pozzoli, a close friend of the Bergoglio family.
He said his grandmother taught him to pray. In fact, that is part of his history. His love for Our Lady also grew very spontaneously through his family relationship. He had a Salesian priest who always visited his house. He was a family priest. The priest left an impression on him because the blessing he received from the Salesian priest contained the prayer Sub Tuum Praesidium.
The prayer Sub Tuum Praesidium, which translates to, We fly to thy patronage, is the prayer Pope Francis asked all Catholics to pray.
When I no longer had questions to ask him, he said, Do not you have any more questions? Yes, I said. If you had to summarize it very briefly, who is Our Lady for you? He told me very tenderly, She is my mom. I think she's the only person with whom I can and dare to cry.
In Rome, Melissa Butts, Currents News.
And that is Currents News. I'm Liz Faublas. Just a reminder that Currents News is moving to a new time slot. Starting Monday, December 3rd, the news will air at 7 p.m. And as always, thank you for joining us because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.